President Trump will need lawyers to represent him at the upcoming impeachment trial. His legal team is likely to look quite different from last year's hearing. Sources tell CBS News both White House counsel Pat Cipollone and the president's personal attorney Jay Sekulow are unlikely to be involved in the proceedings. Sekulow told our Major Garrett he's planning to represent the president on any D.C.-based litigation that may arise from the January 6th terror attack. At least one member of the president's previous impeachment team is considered a candidate to return. That is former Harvard Law School professor Alan Dershowitz. He told Politico it would be a, quote, honor and privilege to defend the Constitution on behalf of the president. John Eastman, seen here with Rudy Giuliani, is also considered a candidate for the team. The legal scholar falsely pushed further conspiracies about Vice President-elect Kamala Harris in an op-ed. He recently retired from his role at Chapman University in California after receiving backlash for speaking at the president's rally prior to the riot. Meanwhile, Republicans are torn over the extent to which the president is culpable for the deadly storming of the Capitol. Texas Representative Chip Roy was outspokenly against efforts to overturn election results and believes the president is to blame. However, he opposed impeachment because he felt the article was written on unclear legal ground.
The President of the United States deserves universal condemnation for what was clearly, in my opinion, impeachable conduct, pressuring the vice president to violate his oath of the Constitution to count the electors. Unfortunately, my Democratic colleagues drafted articles that I believe are flawed and unsupportable, focusing on the legal terms of incitement and insurrection. Even noting impeachment does not require meeting a certain legal standard, that danger for open speech and debate in this body and for the Republic is high if the House approves the articles as written.
Alan Jenkins is a professor of practice at Harvard Law School and joins me now. Professor Jenkins, thank you so much for being with us. So Representative Roy went on to say the impeachment measure makes an issue of political speech. He sort of suggested he would rather have seen an impeachment article that was focused on his improper efforts to influence the vice president. So based on what we know about the law and about the president's speech prior to the riots, in which he said, among other things, quote, if you don't fight like hell, you're not going to have a country anymore. Are Mr. Trump's comments protected political speech?
Well, thanks for having me on, Tanya. The First Amendment free speech clause protects our ability to our right to communicate about political topics, to express true facts, but it does not protect incitement of violence or insurrection. It doesn't protect speech that is intended to produce imminent lawless action. And so that's what the president is being accused of. It'll be for Congress and the Senate in this instance, and perhaps courts down the line to decide what his intent was. But what he's being accused of is not protected by the First Amendment.
Do you agree with Representative Roy that perhaps Democrats would have had a stronger case for impeachment if they focused on abuse of power in terms of his trying to influence the vice president illegally?
Yeah, I don't know that it would have been stronger. I think it certainly was an alternative ground that they could have either added or substituted. But, I think it's important. Americans saw, a mob of Confederate flag wielding insurrectionists enter the Capitol building, that sacred hall of power, that people were killed as a result. There were several deaths. And there's a real feeling amongst the American public that there has to be accountability for that action that we all witnessed. None of us were in the room, when President Trump allegedly pressured Vice President Pence, but we all saw that insurrection, and we all saw and heard President Trump's words ahead of it. He certainly inspired that insurrection. Whether he incited it is what will be decided in this impeachment.
Right, and I would imagine they will be looking at the totality of the president's words, leading up to that rally, correct? It wasn't just about what he said at the rally right before the riot, there was language that was being used consistently, for weeks prior that you could argue, led to the insurrection, correct?
That's correct. I mean, one of the things we're looking at is what did President Trump intend? And since we can't get inside of his head, we need to look at all the circumstances. And so all the statements that were made leading up, the fact that there was intel, it was common knowledge that there were large groups of people who were going to march on the Capitol, that they were hanging on every one of the president's words. And then what he did once it was evident that there was a dangerous, a violent insurrection taking place, not calling or calling up the National Guard at the earliest possible moment, not speaking forcefully to his followers to say, this is wrong, stand down, later telling them that he loved them, even as he told them to go home. All of that is evidence of what his intent may have been in calling on people to march on the Capitol.
Right, and it's something a lot of Republican lawmakers seized on when they commented on the president's actions was, as you just pointed out, that period between when the riot started and when the president finally spoke out about it. I mean, he knew what was going on, and quite a long time elapsed between his finally coming out and saying something. And as you pointed out, he did tell them he loved them in that statement as well. So can you argue that the inaction is also part of what led to this article of impeachment?
I think you could certainly argue that it is evidence of what the president intended, and that's at the heart of this charge of inciting insurrection. So it's all highly relevant. All the things that we would have expected any responsible president to do in that moment, whatever his view about the outcome of the election, President Trump failed to do. That tells us, in my view, volumes about what he intended when he called on his followers to march on the Capitol.
Okay, so in making his case for the president on Wednesday, Florida Republican Congressman Greg Steube referenced a 1969 Supreme Court case related to a KKK leader. Let's listen.
The legal elements of incitement are based on the Supreme Court case Brandenburg v. Ohio, in which the Supreme Court set the standard for speech that could be prosecuted without violating the First Amendment. Brandenburg's speech called for violence against groups of Americans, and the court found that Brandenburg's comments were not directed to inciting or producing imminent lawless action. The court found that it was protected speech, and he was calling for violence. That's the current law of the land.
So, Professor, is that case relevant here? Is Steube interpreting it correctly?
If I were the president, I would not be hanging my hat on Brandenburg versus Ohio. That was a case involving a Ku Klux Klan leader who called for violence and a march on the Capitol. The Supreme Court struck down his conviction because the Ohio law that under which he was convicted made it illegal both to incite violence and to speak on behalf of the violent overthrow of the country. And what the Supreme Court found is you can't make it illegal to make abstract statements about, political revenge or activism or even overthrowing the government. But what the court did say is that when a statute makes it unlawful to intend to produce imminent lawless action, and your speech actually does produce that, then you are properly found guilty, and the First Amendment does not protect you. And so, again, that definition of intentionally speaking out in a way to produce imminent lawless action, I think there's plenty of evidence that that's what the president did. But it's a high standard to meet, and it should be for purposes of free speech. The one other thing,
There's
Tanya,
also,
is that, pardon me.
Sure.
Go ahead.
No, please finish.
Okay. The other thing is, we don't know whether that Brandenburg versus Ohio standard even applies in the context of the impeachment of a president. One could certainly argue under our Constitution that if a president of the United States, with the incredible power that that person has under our Constitution, recklessly directs people to take violent action and insurrection, then we don't necessarily have to prove that that is precisely what the president intended. It's never come before the Supreme Court. We don't know the answer to it. I think, as I noted, that Brandenburg doesn't really save the president against these accusations of incitement, but it's also the case that we don't know if Brandenburg would even apply in the context of impeachment.
Right, and that kind of leads into my next question, because regardless of what you can argue the president's intentions were, there were certainly plenty of people in that crowd and plenty of followers who believed he was telling them to do what they did. Our St. Louis affiliate KMOV spoke with a lawyer for one of the rioters in custody, that so-called QAnon shaman, and he told them he wants a pardon for his client, saying, quote, "My client had heard the oft-repeated words of President Trump. The words and invitation of a president are supposed to mean something." So, Professor Jenkins, I don't know if that's legally admissible, but, could this cause a legal issue for the president that his supporters, who are facing federal indictments themselves, say they interpreted his comments as an invitation to storm the Capitol?
Well, you can bet that this is going to come up in the impeachment trial when it happens, and it certainly doesn't help the president. It doesn't decide the question, right? The fact that somebody who hears your speech is inspired to take violent action doesn't mean that that's what you intended. But it certainly shows that this was highly foreseeable. When the president of the United States is speaking to millions and millions of followers, and there is a track record of violence and destructive protest, including at the Michigan State House, any reasonable human being would have foreseen and expected this to be a likely outcome. And I think that statement, hey, we believed what the president said, that this election was stolen and he called on us, he invited us, I think is what the attorney for this particular defendant said. And we took it seriously. I think that's certainly evidence of the foreseeability of this tragedy.
All right. Well, Professor Alan Jenkins, thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thanks.